So here's Wilfrid Sellars, 1912-89. I'm going to start with a few overview because I imagine most of you have no idea who this person is or why you should even care about him. So I'll give an overview, sort of talk about his project, and try and move into the cybernetic connection fairly quickly. I should point out that Sellars does have a little bit of a following among philosophers, both in the States, in the UK, and in Europe. But the idea that cybernetics was in any way important to his project is the thesis, a very particular thesis that I've been promoting and trying to publish and work on. So this is not a standard reading, but perhaps a correct one. So a little basic background. His major philosophical influences can be divided into two main groups, sort of the grand representatives of the sort of philosophical tradition of, Kant, Hegel, Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey. It was also very much influenced by the logical positivists and ordinary language philosophers of his own time. Russell, Carnap, Ryle, and Wittgenstein, all important philosophers for him. Among his major works, starting with noting Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind from 1956, very well-known essay that's been, much published and republished with commentaries. Well, he has appears in the reading assistant graduate programs around the world, and also his work Science and Metaphysics from 1967, both of which I should point out were lectures he gave in the UK. He's sort of trying. He's just wanted to, try and pander to my audience here. Okay, so core commitments. I want to suggest that the following are the central commitments for Sellars' entire project. One core commitment is to a version of naturalism. That's to say, committing to the idea that human cognitive and rational powers, however they're characterized, have got to be in some sense continuous with the kinds of preconceptual patterns of behavior that we see in animals and other, life forms. So there's no magical, there's no magic, there's no jumps, there's nothing about human beings that's spooky, otherworldly, supernatural, what have you. He's also committed to a certain version of empiricism, although it's a version that he develops throughout his work in rather unusual ways, in part because he develops it through a criticism of the logical empiricists or logical positivists. So he is critical of some of their ideas in many ways, but critical in ways that end up contributing to the project of empiricism, which I want to characterize in this kind of flat-footed, dumb way as the idea that all of the cognitive contact the mind has, all of the friction that the mind has with the world, comes about through modifications of sensory consciousness. And that actually becomes very important because it helps fuel his commitment to nominalism, right? The view that however important universals or generals might be, however important we might have universals such as triangularity or dogness or what have you, whatever your universals or general terms might be in any particular language, those terms do not function to indicate how the mind forms into contact with the world, but rather the mind's contact with the world is only and explicitly at the level of concrete particulars. Abstracta are not real, generals are not real, only concrete particulars are where the cognitive rubber hits the road. And that has another important implication that reality does not have any categorical or propositional form at all. that whatever categorical or propositional structure there is in our thoughts about the world is entirely from the contribution the mind makes to experience and not what the world is bringing to bear. So these are some pretty demanding commitments of Sellars's, and one thing that makes Sellars a bit peculiar is that Sellars also tries to accept a great deal from Immanuel Kant, who does not in any way share those commitments. Sellars' project is very much one of trying to trying to combine these two different commitments that are really, on the face of it, quite incompatible. Ideas he inherits from the American naturalistic tradition, as well as commitments he inherits from Kant, and trying to put those together. And one of my main thesis, interpretive claim here, is that for Sellars, cybernetics plays a very important role in how those two ideas are to be sort of married together without total confusion. So what he inherits from Kant? First of all, he inherits the idea that sensibility, our capacity to be affected by objects, is a distinct capacity from our capacity to judge according to rules. The idea that the understanding, our capacity to judge according to rules, our capacity to use concepts, is fundamentally a normative capacity. That to judge is, or to have a concept, to use a concept, is to think according to a rule, right? The concept is just the rule that applies to the use of that word in whatever language one happens to be speaking. And so conceptual thinking is then fraught with ought, to use one of Sellars' phrases, including ought to be's as well as ought to do. So we're using ought in a very liberal sense, not just what one ought to do, but also ought in the sense of what ought to be the case. And Sellars has a complicated theory of normativity on why ought to be's and ought to do's have to both be part of the picture. He also has a great deal to say about the role of the productive imagination, a Kantian term. And in his theory of experience, Sellars ends up developing the idea that perception involves the construction of what he calls image models, which are constructed through a combination of these bottom-up sensory receptiveness combined with a kind of top-down recipes, as he calls it, provided by our concepts. And I've tried arguing at some in a recent paper that what Sellars is up to here is actually very similar to what we see in the sort of predictive processing story developed by Friston and by Seth and by Jakob Hoey and Andy Clark and many others. I am probably less enthused by the story now than I was when I wrote that paper. But I think something like that is going to be important for understanding what Sellars is up to in his theory of mind. So given this Kantian background, Sellars disagrees with Kant in several major ways. And these are the two in particular I want to focus on for understanding why Sellars would then want to be interested in cybernetics. One is that, unlike Kant, Sellars thinks that scientific realism, the idea that our scientific theories should be understood as moving as sort of an asymptotic approximation to the fundamental structure of reality. That's a very Peircean thought that Sellars takes up, and he recognizes that if we're going to have a story like that, then we can't be pure Kantians. We can't think that science is restricted to phenomenal knowledge only. He also thinks, again against Kant, that the basic categorical framework the mind has for interpreting the world is not innate. Right? If you read Kant, you read the Critique of Pure Reason, you might be inclined to say, well, okay, we've got these categories, that's great. Where do they come from? And Kant just says nothing at all about that. He has no genetic story It's a purely transcendental account. Later philosophers did try and build genetic component into a Kantian story. Jean Piaget, the well-known psychologist, called his psychology a genetic epistemology. He did think he was trying to do a kind of story about how categories emerge through psychological development. That's certainly not a Kantian story. But Piaget's account is the kind of thing Sellars would have found very interesting, because Sellars follows, Carnap and Wittgenstein and Ryle in thinking that the categories are themselves fundamentally sociolinguistic structures. And as such, the categories are acquired in the process of learning first language. So the categories can't be innate. And this means that at some point in the story, Sellars recognizes there has to be room for something that is cognition or cognition-like, but which is not categorically structured in the way that normal adult human cognition is. So Sellars has to say the Kantian story might be right for, us philosophers reflecting on the nature of thought, but that can't be the whole story. There has to be room somewhere on our account for the kind of cognition that is good enough at reliably detecting patterns, that it can detect patterns of linguistic usage and then glom onto those patterns and extract the kinds of regularities so they can sort of figure out what the categories are. So this then leads to the next big part of the story, which is how I want to read Sellars as naturalizing Kant with cybernetics. And I think the big concept Sellars gets from cybernetics is the concept of feedback loops. I think this is, in a way, what I take to be the Rosetta Stone for Sellars' philosophy, and I'll explain more about why I take it that way. Now, it's worth pointing out what exactly did Sellars read of cybernetics and when did he read it? There's a lot of research here that I have yet to do and that really no one has yet done. All I can tell you is that so far is that there are some cybernetic texts in the Sellars archive at the University of Pittsburgh. We know that he owned a copy of Wiener's Cybernetics book, and we also know that he owned a copy of this very interesting 1952 symposium, Mentality in Machines, with Wisdom, McKay, and Spilsbury. So he very likely could have read other cybernetics texts before and after these, but these are the ones we know occurred in his own personal library. So I want to use a lot of Wiener in this talk, because I think Wiener is an interesting philosopher in his own right. I think he's sort of an interesting philosopher, mathematician. His own philosophical works have been kind of neglected, but before he was doing much mathematics, he was publishing philosophy, and he has like several pieces on theories of knowledge and metaphysics that are kind of interesting in their own right. He certainly studied a lot of philosophy. He studied with Josiah Royce briefly. He studied with Russell and with Dewey. He was certainly a slouch when it comes to major philosophical issues. And I think it comes out here and there in his understanding about how to present cybernetics in his role as a public intellectual, in particular in the human use of human beings. So in this, in his 48 cybernetics text, he says this interesting thing when to say like the big breakthrough of cybernetics is taking seriously the ontology of information. Like information is not just a category that we have to use in making in any metaphysics that science gives us, right? Any scientific metaphysics that we're going to have has to be one that takes information very seriously. He has this remarkable claim. I guess these are claims from later that pick up on nicely on what Joe was saying a moment ago, right? So the central nervous system is not this self-contained organ. It is engaged in its ongoing reciprocal relationships with its environment. It's engaged in a kind of circular causality with its environment. It's probably worth pointing out that before the Macy conferences, at first, I believe, were called, the Macy conferences in circular causality and teleological mechanisms. And that was actually the name for the conferences. Then Weiner coins the term cybernetics in his work, and then Heinz von Foerster suggests that they use the word cybernetics to refer to the Macy conferences. So the concern throughout the entire period is with the concern of circular causality, not as a linear A causes B causes C causes D kind of thing, but rather circular causal processes. And that thinking of circular causality as a way to give us a mechanistic theory of teleological phenomena. I think that's sort of very central to what the cyberneticists thought they were doing. I think it comes out very clearly in Weiner's 43 paper, Behavior, Purpose, and Teleology. Whether they really were doing that, I think, is a fascinating open question. Whether they succeeded in doing that is another question, but I think they were very clearly attempting to do that. And that plays into a very important role in how they think what they're doing as developing mechanistic systems, or mechanistic in a very broad sense, systems that can be in a kind of continual interaction with their environments. And so in this picture, there is not much room for much internal storage or internal representation. As long as there's enough, there has to be only enough structure in the central nervous system to be able to sort of monitor and keep track of the regularities, you can generate all the intelligent behavior the way you want to generate. I think this is then important for what Sellars wants to do. Sellars has a distinction between what he calls signifying and picturing. And this has caused a lot of confusion among Sellarsians, because what he means by signifying is tolerably clear, but what he means by picturing is very opaque. What he means by signifying is how we conceptualize the relationship between thought and the world. So when we do phenomenology, we do knowing language philosophy, we're doing our philosophy of language, we're producing sentences of the sort, snow is white if and only if snow is white, if we're sort of following our Tarski and T schemas. Well, just trying to sort of explicate within language what we take the thought-world relationship to be like. And many philosophers have been doing that before Sellars and after and since. And Sellars just basically takes that for granted. He says, well, for that kind of thing, Carnap and Wittgenstein, they basically get it. We don't really need to elaborate on that too much. But Sellars says, following that line of thought means that we cannot appeal to language to ground the connection between thought and the world. What we need is something quite different. What we need is to understand how thought and the world are not merely conceptualized as connected, but to understand how they really are connected. And this is where Sellars introduces the term picturing. And this leads to some puzzles, because he borrows this term from the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus by Wittgenstein, and this causes all sorts of interpretive problems and puzzles, in part because people who read the Tractatus without knowing where Wittgenstein gets this term from, then get into interpretive troubles. Because if you, Wittgenstein gets this term from the philosopher of physics, Heinrich Hertz, I think it was. Nicholas Heineck, Hertz, sort of interesting, one of those interesting German polymaths. And Hertz uses picturing to refer to how diagrams and blueprints work. So it's an interesting part where, Wittgenstein is in many ways trying to combine Hertz with Frege. So here's Wittgenstein building on the tradition of scientific diagrams as picturing, and trying to think about how signs and propositions picture in that kind of way. But then that's a dimension of Wittgenstein's project that Sellars picks up and then runs with. But he adds a very important component to the Wittgensteinian picture that Wittgenstein lacks, and that's the concept of feedback loops. In the Tractatus, picturing is basically static. And so he will actually use fairly static examples of picturing, such as a sheet of music pictures the song or the melody. And what Sellars wants to do is think about picturing in much more dynamic feedback loop-driven terms. And that's where I think we see Sellars appropriating cybernetics. So here's a bit of text from Sellars from his 1960 article, Being and Being Known. Page numbers are from the edition in his collection, Science, Perception, and Reality. So here he says, there's an isomorphism, a direct mapping between intellect and the world, but it happens, as it were, in two different registers. In the intellectual or logical order, as we reflect on the nature of thought from within it, but also in the real world, in the real order, when we're thinking about what minds are actually doing as they track their environments. And it's the confusion between these two ideas that's actually led, Sellars claims, to a great deal of confusion. And he is actually pretty, he does not hold back at all. He basically wants to claim the entire Western tradition has been confused ever since Aristotle and Plato because of a failure to make this proper distinction between these two different ways in which it makes sense to say that the intellect is related to the world. To make clear what he means to say the intellect is related to the world, he gives us this hypothetical experiment. Suppose an anthropoid robot of the future, this is the example he gives in 1960, is wired in such a way that it can explore its environment through a kind of, it says emits a high frequency radiation. So, you know, he's thinking about like how, so something like a combination between a submarine and a bat, right? Something instead of emitting radiation to the environment, receiving these profiles back from its environment, and then using that to build up a cognitive map of what's going on. Just an aside, it's worth pointing out that Sellars almost certainly was familiar with Edward Tolman's work on cognitive maps. The phrase cognitive map had been coined by Tolman in 1948, and Sellars was almost certainly familiar with those ideas. So Sellars was almost certainly influenced by a lot of stuff coming out of cutting-edge behaviorism, as well as by cybernetics. So we can imagine a robot wandering into the environment and having engaged in these sort of perceptual uptakes, and then using uptakes to sort of make inferences about what to expect, and then navigating its environment in ways that then lead to novel perceptual uptakes. And in doing so, it is acting in ways that are genuinely epistemic, right? Or ways that could be ascribed in epistemic terms, right? It is coming to learn more about its environment. It's coming to know more about its environment. It's coming to build an increasingly adequate map of its environment. And it's doing so through epistemic operations that we have no trouble calling induction and inference and abduction when we do it. So this robot is, a fully fledged epistemic agent in roughly the same sense that we are, even though what it's doing can be cashed out entirely in mechanistic terms. So, we could describe what it's doing in epistemic terms, but we could always drop down to the level of the electrical engineer and describe simply what's happening at the level of its, at the computational level.
About 5 minutes, Carl.
Okay. So we picture in just the same way, and this is one of my smoking guns because this is actually the only reference to cybernetics in anything published by Sellars I've yet seen. But he says, what we know from cybernetic theory is that the central nervous system is picturing for us in the same way that the robots' computational systems are picturing for it. So since I have 5 minutes left, I'm going to move past a couple of slides. I do have some quotes from Daniel Williams, which is a paper of his, where he's trying to look to predictive processing as giving us a new notion of representation that might get past the representation wars between the strong representationalists that Joe talked about versus the strong anti-representationalists, the inactivists. And so I think insofar as what Williams is doing here, as well as other work that Joe and others have been doing, so there's a real interest in a kind of representation that is not linguistic, is not propositional, and I think that's actually what Sellars was already getting at in his work in the 1960s. So I think we work by Lezdujewski, Williams and Colling on second-order structure representations, I think give us a nice way of understanding how to make sense of picturing as a causally grounded cartographic relationship between states of the cognitive system and features of the environment which are affecting that system. I want to now conclude my last few minutes with the question, should Sellars have been a second-order cybernetician? Because he has this interesting big claim from the end of his essay, Philosophy and Scientific Image of Man, that we need to somehow join the scientific and manifest images. The image that we have, the world we get from the sciences, has to be joined with our ordinary, sort of practically, reflectively informed self-conception. And the way to join these two images, he ends up saying, is by construing, whatever he means by that, the actions that we intend to do and circumstances in which we intend to perform them directly in scientific terms. We relate to the world directly in science and make it the scientific world our world and no longer an alien appendage to the ordinary world in which we act. But I wonder, first of all, how it is that our actions and circumstances could be construed in cybernetic terms, but also seems to me that if Sellars taking this idea very seriously means that Sellars should have taken the turn from observed systems to observing systems, and that he should have followed von Filster much more in taking the turn towards second-order cybernetics. And I find it interesting that Sellars doesn't take that, and I just wonder, is that a blind spot in his own thinking? Is he just it just didn't occur to him? Should he have taken phenomenology more seriously than he already did? Or how deep does this blind spot go in Sellars' own thinking? And that's something I'm actually working on right now. Okay,